What if everything you've been told about the Russia-China alliance is a carefully constructed illusion? What if, behind the handshakes and the summit photos and the theatrical declarations of unlimited friendship, Russia's own intelligence service has already written one word next to China's name? And that word is enemy? That's not a theory. That's not a think tank speculation. That's the actual language sitting inside a leaked 8-page internal document produced by the FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service, the most powerful intelligence agency on Russian soil. And once you understand what's really written in that document and what it means for the world you're living in right now, you will never look at the so-called Russia-China axis the same way again. Because this isn't just about two governments pretending to be friends while stabbing each other in the back. This is about the entire geopolitical narrative that's been sold to the American public. The story of an unstoppable Eastern Bloc rising together against the West, quietly falling apart from the inside. And the people who know this best are the Russian spies themselves. The leaked report was produced by the FSB's Department of Counterintelligence Operations, known by its Russian acronym DKRO, and its 7th Service, a previously undisclosed unit specifically tasked with counterintelligence planning and operations against Asian countries, with China as its primary target. The document was acquired by Ares Leaks, a cybercriminal syndicate, which posted images of the document on the Telegram Messenger application. The New York Times then shared the leaked document with 6 Western intelligence agencies, all of which assessed it to be genuine. 6, not 1, not 2. 6 separate Western intelligence organizations looked at this document and said, yes, this is real. So we're not talking about a forgery or a planted story. We're talking about a window into the genuine private thinking of the Russian security establishment. Now here's where it gets deeply interesting, because you have to hold two things in your mind at the same time to truly grasp what this moment means. On one hand, you have Vladimir Putin meeting Xi Jinping in Moscow as recently as May of 2025, shaking hands, signing joint statements, pledging to further deepen their partnership, performing this brotherhood for the cameras of the world. Putin and Xi have met dozens of times and praised the so-called no-limits partnership between their nations. Military drills, energy deals, and soaring trade figures appear to cement what looks like a powerful alliance. That's the public theater, that's the image being projected outward. But then on the other hand, you have this document, written by the very intelligence apparatus that serves Putin, and inside that document, China is not a brother, China is not a partner. A secret FSB counterintelligence unit labels China as the enemy, and accuses Beijing of actively recruiting Russian officials, scientists, and business people, the enemy. In Russian intelligence language, that word carries the full weight of institutional hostility. They don't use that word casually, they use it operationally, and this is something that people in the United States need to sit with for a moment, because the dominant narrative coming out of Washington for the past several years has been built on the premise that Russia and China represent a unified, coordinated challenge to American power, that they are strategically aligned, that they move together, that confronting one means confronting both. And yet here is Russia's own deep state, in its own internal planning documents, identifying China not as an ally, but as a strategic threat requiring active counterintelligence operations. What does that tell you about the quality of the analysis you've been getting from the people who are supposed to understand these things? The FSB claims that Chinese intelligence operatives are targeting Russian scientists, defense officials, and institutions to obtain sensitive military technology, including drone warfare tactics and countermeasures against Western weapons. China spies on Russian military operations in Ukraine to learn about Western weapons and warfare methods. Intelligence officers fear Chinese scientists are preparing grounds to claim Russian territory. They also warned that Chinese intelligence conducts espionage in the Arctic using mining companies and university research centers as cover. Read that again slowly. China is using Russia's own war, the war Russia started in Ukraine, as a live intelligence laboratory. Chinese defense officials and researchers began arriving in Russia shortly after the February 2022 invasion, not to help Russia win, but to study, to observe, to extract. Beijing is seeking to observe and analyze Moscow's battlefield strategies to prepare for potential future conflicts involving the Chinese military, particularly around Taiwan or the South China Sea. China's army hasn't fought a real war since its brief and costly conflict with Vietnam in 1979. And so it is using Russia's soldiers, Russia's equipment, Russia's blood in Ukraine as a classroom. The FSB knows this. And the FSB is alarmed. Of particular interest to Beijing is information about combat methods using drones, modernization of their software, and methods for countering new types of Western weapons. The FSB document states that Beijing believes the war in Ukraine will be prolonged. China is betting on a long war. China wants Russia tied down. China wants Russia bleeding slowly and expending resources and growing weaker relative to the rest of the world, while China itself watches, learns, and quietly strengthens. This is the cold logic of a rising power that has identified exactly the opportunity it needs. And what's fascinating, genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective, is that this is precisely the kind of strategic patience that China has demonstrated for decades. While others make noise, China makes moves. While Russia wages a war that grinds away its demographic reserves and its economic resilience, China is harvesting the intelligence dividends. Now let's talk about territory, because this is where the story becomes almost surreal in its depth. The FSB document highlights Russia's deep-rooted mistrust of China across their 2,615-mile shared border, and points out how Chinese nationalists have long challenged 19th-century treaties under which Russia acquired vast territories, including what is now Vladivostok. Vladivostok was ceded to Tsarist Russia in 1860 under the Treaty of Peking. China has never fully made peace with those 19th-century land transfers. And what the FSB is documenting now is that this is not just a matter of historical grievance being discussed in academic circles in Beijing. It is becoming operationalized. The FSB warns of Chinese academic efforts to find ancient Chinese peoples in Russia's Far East and spread revanchist narratives. A 2023 Chinese map labeled areas of Russia with historical Chinese names. Think about what that means strategically. Before a country ever makes a territorial move, it first establishes a historical and cultural narrative, it plants the intellectual seeds, it publishes the maps, it funds the researchers, it creates the story that says this land was always ours, and we are simply reclaiming what belongs to us. Russia did exactly this with Ukraine for years before 2022, and now the FSB is watching China do something structurally similar, quietly, methodically, in the Russian Far East. Most provocative is the FSB's concern about China's intentions in the Russian Far East. This vast and underpopulated region, rich in resources and historically contested, was annexed by the Russian Empire through treaties China has never fully accepted. Russia's Far East is enormous, sparsely populated, resource-rich, and, this is crucial, demographically hollowing out. The Russian population in that region has been declining for decades. Meanwhile, the Chinese population in the border regions on the other side has been growing. Chinese investment into the Russian Far East has been growing. Chinese economic activity, Chinese workers, Chinese trade networks, all of it has been deepening its roots. And the FSB is watching all of this and drawing conclusions that contradict everything Putin says publicly about his relationship with Xi. The FSB launched a counterintelligence operation named Entente 4 just days before the February 2022 invasion. The program aimed to prevent the transfer of strategic information to Beijing and called for proactive engagements with Russian citizens involved in China-related sectors. 3 days before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the FSB was already running a covert operation to block Chinese espionage. The name itself, Entente 4, is deeply ironic, referencing the concept of diplomatic closeness while being designed to guard against a so-called friend. The FSB ordered its officers to hold in-person meetings with Russian citizens closely cooperating with China, warning them that Beijing was seeking to exploit Russia and extract its advanced scientific research. Russian intelligence also ordered continuous information gathering on users of the Chinese messenger app WeChat. This included hacking targets' phones and analyzing data using software controlled by the FSB unit. Russia is hacking the phones of people using a Chinese app. Russia hacking Chinese apps. And people are still describing these two countries as unbreakable partners. The FSB notes that Beijing also views its relationship with Russia with a similar level of caution. The document disclosed that Chinese intelligence administers polygraph tests to agents returning from Russia and closely monitors over 20,000 Russian students currently studying in China, so both sides are running polygraphs on each other's people. Both sides are conducting surveillance on the other's nationals living within their borders. Both sides have active counterintelligence programs targeting the other. And both sides are standing in front of cameras pretending to be the best of friends. This is not an alliance. This is a managed rivalry wrapped in the costume of partnership. And understanding the difference between those two things is essential if you want to understand where the world is actually going. Now, here is the part that gets into the deeper logic of power, and this is where I want you to really focus, because this is the analytical layer that most of the mainstream coverage misses entirely. Some analysts interpret China's strategy as a slow, calculated campaign to wear down its rivals. Beijing supports Moscow just enough to keep it bogged down in Ukraine and diplomatically isolated. As Russia weakens under the pressure of war and sanctions, China expands its economic, technological, and territorial influence, positioning itself to benefit from Russia's decline. China is not trying to help Russia win. China is trying to ensure that Russia remains useful while gradually becoming dependent. And there is a massive difference between those two goals. A Russia that wins quickly in Ukraine and emerges stronger is a Russia that has less need for Chinese economic lifelines and Chinese goodwill. A Russia that grinds on for years, that exhausts itself, that becomes increasingly isolated from Western markets and Western technology, that needs Chinese goods and Chinese trade more and more desperately with each passing season. That Russia is far more manageable from Beijing's perspective. China doesn't need Russia as an equal partner. China needs Russia as a supplier, as a buffer, and eventually as a dependent. By early 2025, Chinese electronics reportedly made up 80% of those found in Russian drones. 80%. Russia's military drone program, one of the most critical technologies in its war effort, is running on Chinese components. That is not partnership, that is dependency. And the FSB knows that dependency in an intelligence context is vulnerability. Because if China is supplying 80% of the electronics in your weapon systems, China knows exactly what's inside those weapon systems. China can study the performance data. China can assess the weaknesses. China is, in effect, deeply embedded in the Russian military-industrial supply chain, and that is an intelligence asset of extraordinary value. The DKRO report cautions FSB officials to avoid publicly referring to China and the Chinese intelligence services as potential enemies of Russia. Doing so could generate media headlines that may cause embarrassment for the Kremlin and have negative consequences for bilateral relations between Russia and China. This is perhaps the most telling line in the entire document. The FSB privately believes China is the enemy. The FSB is running active counterintelligence programs against China. The FSB is monitoring Chinese apps, hacking Chinese intelligence targets, warning Russian scientists about Chinese recruitment operations. And yet the FSB is instructed, explicitly instructed, not to say any of this out loud because it would be embarrassing, because the Kremlin needs the relationship with Beijing to hold, at least publicly, at least for now. The political leadership is telling its own intelligence apparatus to keep the truth hidden from the Russian people and from the world. That is not the behavior of a confident, secure partnership. That is the behavior of a relationship built on necessity and maintained through mutual pretense. The New York Times publication of the leaked FSB document may be a form of psychological and information warfare intended to worsen relations between Moscow and Beijing. This strategic communication aims to fracture their alliance, sow discord within the Russian leadership, and influence Kremlin foreign policy. The aim might be to create sufficient internal and external pressure on Russia to prompt a reassessment of its position and encourage engagement with Western proposals for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. This is a genuinely important point to sit with, and I want to be honest about it because intellectual honesty demands it. There are serious analysts who argue that the very publication of this document by the New York Times serves a Western intelligence agenda, that by surfacing this leak, the US and its allies are attempting to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing, to make each suspicious of the other, to fracture what has been the most consequential geopolitical partnership of the past decade. That's a real possibility. Intelligence services do this. They leak strategically, they shape narratives. The fact that the document was verified by 6 Western intelligence agencies doesn't remove the possibility that those same Western agencies had a hand in ensuring it reached the public. But here's what that framing misses. Even if the publication is strategic, the content of the document still reveals something true and important about the underlying dynamic. You can use a real fact strategically. You can choose when and how to reveal a genuine truth for maximum effect. The weaponization of information doesn't make the information false. And what this document reveals, regardless of who chose to surface it and why, is that the Russia-China relationship is far more complicated, far more adversarial beneath the surface, and far more fragile than the narrative of an unbreakable Eastern Axis would have you believe. Paul Colby, a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, who served for 25 years in the CIA Directorate of Operations, including in Russia, told The Times, To go back to the old adage, there is no such thing as friendly intel services. You don't have to scratch very deep in any Russian military or intel official to get deep suspicion of China. In the long run, China is, in spite of the unlimited partnership and how useful they are, also a potential threat. A man who spent 25 years inside CIA operations in Russia is telling you that the suspicion runs deep, that it's structural, that it's not something Putin can negotiate away with a few more summit photos. Because the FSB's concern about China isn't ideological, it's geographic, it's historical, it's demographic. Russia has an enormous, resource-rich, sparsely populated eastern territory sitting next to a massive, dynamic, historically aggrieved neighbor that has never fully accepted the treaties that gave Russia that territory in the first place. That tension doesn't go away because two leaders shake hands, it deepens with time. And here is what all of this means for you, sitting in America, trying to make sense of a world that feels more unstable and more complex with every passing year. The story of a unified anti-American axis, Russia and China marching together toward a new world order, was always a simplification. It captured something real about their shared interest in reducing American dominance. But it missed the competition underneath, the mutual suspicion, the fact that two powers with overlapping territorial ambitions and a long history of hostility don't simply become trustworthy allies because they share a common adversary. History doesn't work that way. Power doesn't work that way. What this FSB leak reveals, at its core, is that the great geopolitical contest of our era is not simply the West versus the rest. It is a multipolar competition in which every major power is playing against every other major power simultaneously, on multiple boards at once, using trade and intelligence and military presence and historical narrative as the pieces. Russia and China are using each other because they need to, not because they trust each other. And when necessity runs its course, when Russia's war ends, when the sanctions calculus shifts, when the balance of dependency tilts too far in one direction, that relationship will fracture along exactly the fault lines that the FSB has already identified and documented. The spies always know before the diplomats admit it. And now, so do you.